Got a full house. Everyone loves talking accountability. That's right. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, I noticed that check mark. We good? Hi, everyone. My name is Andy Smerick. I am a partner at Bellwether Education Partners, a DC-based education reform organization, also with offices in Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. I also blog for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute's Flypaper blog, one of their family of blogs here. So thank you very much for being here. We are here to talk about accountability. The event is called Opt Out or Cop Out. It's a wonderful, I think, subject, really important for the future of accountability, federal level, state level, local level, charters, so forth. Excuse me. Someone have water? Can we get some? Actually, why don't we just dispense with my opening, and Mike, can you just kick off?
All right. Yes. Well played, Nelson, with the Rubio remarks. Yes. All right. Well, as Andy was saying, thank you so much for being here. And for those of you tuning in online, Thomas B. Fordham Institute, one of the leading education policy think tanks, as well as sponsored as well as Democrats for Education Reform. I'm glad to team up on this. So I think this event came about after I wrote a piece, part of my debate with Debbie Meyer this spring on the Education Next blog, Bridging Differences. And it was Charlie's idea to maybe have a public debate and discussion about it. And I'll lay out what I argued in that piece. And it was basically to allow schools, some perhaps small group of schools, to opt out of their regular state testing and accountability programs and requirements. Now, let me make it clear from the beginning that I think everybody else up here on the panel, am a strong supporter of standards-based reform and a strong supporter of accountability and education. And I'm also a strong supporter of the Common Core standards. If you don't know that, you've been under a rock. And I firmly believe that it makes sense to try to figure out what is it that students need to know and be able to do in order to succeed at the next level of education. So in the K-12 system, that means what do kids need to know and be able to do to go on and do well in college or to get a good paying job? And I think the Common Core are doing exactly that. They're doing a very good job of trying to identify what the knowledge and skills are that people really need to know for that next step in education. And I think that for the vast majority of our schools, using the Common Core as the standards and then the Common Core assessments as the measures of whether or not schools are getting kids where they need to be, that works and it makes a lot of sense. It's based on a hypothesis, the hypothesis being that if students do well against those standards and do well on the Common Core tests, those tests are set at a high enough level, that the hypothesis is then those students will be able to go on and do well in college or go on and get a good paying job. And I think that hypothesis makes sense. We can't prove it right now, but I think it all makes sense. And probably for 90% of the schools, I think this all works. I would also argue, though, that there might be, say, 10% of the schools out there for whom the Common Core for the Common Core and other state standards before them may not be a good fit. By the way, Michelle wants me to remind all of you in studio and at home that it is hashtagged opt out or opt or cop. Opt or cop. Opt or cop. Opt or cop. Okay. As I was saying. All right. So, but for the 10%, the other 10% of the schools, I think we should be open to allowing them to opt out of the Common Core, at least as the measure of their success and their effectiveness. Now, who are these 10 schools? I would say, first of all, 10% of the schools. I would say, first of all, it is some schools of choice. charter schools, also magnet schools, but some schools of choice that have an educational approach and philosophy that is just not going to be a good fit with standards-based reform, right? That particularly are going to be on the sort of far progressive end of the spectrum, who may say, we just don't fundamentally believe in testing as a great measure of what kids need to know and be able to do, or we have an approach that's a curricular approach or a project-based approach where, if we do our approach, we do it faithfully, we cannot guarantee that we're going to actually prepare kids for this particular, say, 4th grade test, and our kids are going to end up looking bad on these tests. But we still think we're actually providing a very strong education. And in fact, we think we can show evidence of that. So an example would be High Tech High out in California, these very successful charter schools. And they will tell you that their test scores on state tests aren't great. They're kind of mediocre, particularly considering the students that they're serving. However, their college-going rates and their college graduation rates are through the roof. They're quite remarkable. So they would say, look, we don't think the California tests really measure what we view as the most essential skills to help kids get ready. What I'm saying is I would allow High Tech High to come up with another set of measures, rigorous measures, outcome-based measures, to substitute for the state testing. That might be, long-term outcomes like college going and college graduation. The other schools beyond schools of choice is I would say there are some schools out there where virtually all of the kids are high-achieving kids and for whom the Common Core standards or any other standards are actually well below where they're already achieving. Okay, so these are going to be your very affluent suburban schools, for example, or maybe some of the exam schools that are out there. And here again, I would say, look, if they can show you that overwhelmingly their students are going on to take AP exams and doing well in AP exams, or IB or other rigorous exams, then don't make them worry about the Common Core because they're already demonstrating even higher standards than what we have on these other state standards, and particularly if they can show that for all their kids. Now, I think this makes sense both for a variety of reasons. Number one, I think these could be more accurate measures of effectiveness for this handful of schools. Number two, I do worry about us making good schools look bad. Okay, and this won't solve everything. I mean, we could talk about the importance of looking at growth over time instead of just proficiency, et cetera. But this is one important way to make sure that we're not unfairly dinging schools that are actually effective schools, but maybe the tests don't show that. And number three, frankly, it is in part to let out some steam from the political backlash to standards and testing, okay, which particularly comes from some on the right around issues of school choice, in the world of charter schools, also in the world of private schools, in the states that now are moving towards voucher programs that require state testing. And that it also helps in the Westchester counties of the world, and the Montgomery counties of the world, and these other affluent areas, which is where we see a lot of the resistance to testing coming from. The backstory in Oklahoma, they pull out of the park. Why is it? Well, they're getting huge pressure from the affluent suburbs of Oklahoma City and Tulsa saying there's too much testing. So for all those reasons, I think this is an idea whose time has come.
Okay, so we want to make sure that you guys get to be part of this discussion as well. So why we gave you that hashtag is so you can tweet me questions throughout this thing, and I'm going to try to litter them throughout this conversation as we go along to try to keep it. So this can be like a group therapy session, so we're not just working out our issues. This one. So we can work this all out together. So who should we start with? Charlie, let me kick it off to you to begin with. What is everything wrong with Mike's idea? Why should we be afraid of this?
This 10% thing is new to the conversation. I'll tell you that Mike threw this in today. Not the conversation we had, but that's okay. Look, it sounds like what Mike is talking about is more opt up than opt out. He's talking about schools that want to move to a higher standard, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there's nothing in current policy that's preventing them from doing that now. If you're a good actor and you want to, in addition to some very basic tests around math or reading, also factor in AP courses or college attendance or college completion, you're free to do that. Anybody can do it today, and people are already doing it today. Joshua Starr in Montgomery County has a whole assessment system he's implementing now that measures students' feelings on things like hope and well-being and how happy they are at school. Nothing in current law stops him from doing that. The only thing it stops him from doing is saying that if a school has low math and reading scores with its students or with subgroups of students, it can't use how good kids feel to cover up low academic performance. And I think that's what we're trying to guard against here, the folks who are a little bit anxious about Mike's proposal. And I guess I wish we understood better why the backlash on testing is coming from certain places. And I think until we figure that out, we don't really know what the solution is to meet those concerns. I don't know if it's upset because in some schools things looked like they were okay and now they don't, or if there are other reasons. I find it puzzling that in Westchester County, New York, 20, 30 years ago, when only the top 10% elite schools and students in New York had to take the Regents, there was no backlash against testing. So why in Westchester County is there now backlash against testing when all kids have to take those tests? Especially when most of those parents have their kids in after-school programs to study for the SAT, to study for their AP courses, and other things that they need to get into college. That doesn't add up to me. And they're not pushing back on those kinds of tests. So there's some sort of sociological phenomenon that's going on here that may not be what it seems to be on its face, or what folks are trying to explain is their reason for opposing it. I don't know the reason. You could generate a lot of hypotheses, but it doesn't make sense to react to that unless we know really what's driving it.
So Charlie Barone from Democrats for Education Reform. So let me ask Rob Lake from Center for Reinventing Public Education at the University of Washington. I want to begin with like a charter school question, if you don't mind. So charters have been doing this for, call it 20 years, coming up with personalized, individualized accountability programs. What can we learn from that? And is maybe the answer just to have the charter model of authorizers extend to all schools, so schools can do, like Mike says, come up with their own accountability plan so they can be tailored to the needs of that school?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Several of us on this panel have some ideas on the charter sector and how it's unrolled on this front. But you know, I think you're picking on me because, like Nelson and Delia, I've been doing the work on charters for some time and watched since the early years. Still? Okay, how's that? There we go. You know, the original idea behind the charter was supposed to define individualized goals and you know, specific indicators for a school's renewal at the end of the 5 years. And it was a great idea. It really set the stage for schools to individualize what they were trying to do, to be very, very mission focused, right? But what happened over time, and part of the reason that charters became kind of, you know, swamped in the general accountability structure, was that schools could always present some reason why they shouldn't be closed that way. By picking their own indicators, they could say, but I'm doing really well on this front, but with this group of kids on this particular mission, you know. And we have authorizers, as many, you know, as we all know, who don't like to close schools, would look for any excuse not to. And our problem right now in chartering, and I would say with district schools as well, is we don't have the leverage, the political cover for folks to do the hard work of authorizing that they need to do. And I'm afraid, as much as I have sympathy with the idea, I'm really afraid that this just becomes a slippery slope for letting more bad schools off the hook. There's no way for schools to fail.
Good point. Okay, Delia Pompa from NCLR. Maybe the same question to you, but with this angle. I think a lot of us have big concerns about what this would do for the achievement gap. We needed NCLB. We needed tough accountability, so we were looking after the interests of all kids. And this feels a little bit to me like an opportunity for some schools to stop caring about all kids. It gives them a pathway to that.
You feel right then.
Oh, great.
You know, I could use all sort of the time-worn phrases, slippery slope, not in my backyard. Who are we worried about? The politicians, the parents? Are we worried about the kids? You know, somebody mentioned Westchester County and Montgomery County. Has anybody looked at the demographics there lately? There are a lot of typical suburban kids doing well there, white middle-class students. But have you looked at their demographics? Westchester County, which you would never believe had any kind of minority, now is a settling out place for migrants. And those kids are not doing well. So giving what we think of as high-performing schools some flexibility to opt out is actually creating a worse situation for the minority kids in those locations. You know, for the longest time, NCLR has supported charter schools. We work with a network of 115 charter schools. And even within our network, I say there are schools that shouldn't be open because they're not serving kids well. We're taking kids out of the district public schools because we think we can serve them better in charter schools. And when we take away that accountability, we leave the door wide open for these kids to fail again. I can't begin to tell you, or I can begin to tell you, but I'm not going to tell you how long I've been in education and how long, like many of us, we've seen accountability change in Title I from you tell us what you're going to do and how well you're going to do to you have to do it this way. And maybe the pendulum is swinging where we're being a little more sensible. I don't know what lessons we're going to learn from the waiver process. I don't know what lessons we're going to learn from some flexibility. But we've got to look at reality and learn some lessons this time instead of saying, why don't we try this on the kids this time? We just really need to look at how standards really work in reality and what accountability is really telling us.
So Twitter is blowing up right now. Like, everyone seems to have latched on to something that Robin said, the slippery slope idea. And I think this is important, and I think it's perfect that we have Nelson Smith here to talk about this. He's now a senior advisor at NACSA, but had been the president and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. But he's been doing some work recently on looking at accountability systems in the charter sector for alternative schools.
Right.
So actually thinking about this, how do we take a look at different types of schools and build accountability systems for them? So what do you think? Slippery slope?
Well, you know, I want to go back to Mike for a second. If you could give me an ironclad guarantee that it would never be more than 10% of the schools opting out, I'd almost be tempted to agree that it's a good idea. I push back for all the same reasons that my colleagues have stated very well about accountability and so forth, and for one other reason, which is that we're given the way the anti-testing fervor has gone and the reasons that it's been there, I think we're in the process of fixing a lot of that. I mean, I really think that with the advent of the Common Core and the Common Core tests, that because they're going to be much broader and deeper, because you can't ace them by going through testing boot camp, and because you have to have a lot of background knowledge to succeed in them, I think that that's going to diffuse some of the problem with testing and actually give educators something that's not just useful for accountability purposes, but also for improving instruction. To Andy's point, we are doing work now with alternative charter schools and how you hold them accountable. And by alternative, I mean those that deal with the most challenged populations, former dropouts, kids who've been incarcerated or in the juvenile justice system, kids with histories of substance abuse and so forth. For these kids, the assessment results, and for the schools that teach them, assessment results from very conventional standardized tests often tell you nothing about what to do as a next step. They may tell you something useful about their current status. It's good to know if kids have a third grade reading level and they're 17 years old. I think that's important knowledge to know. But at the same time, it doesn't give you or the educators in those schools anything useful to go on. So what we're working towards is, one, how do you make something useful out of the standardized assessments? How do you create metrics and measures so that you can use them properly to gauge not just status but progress for these kids? And number two, what else do you add into the mix? You mentioned high-tech high, Mike, and certainly for any charter school, they should never be judged just on the basis of one test, as I would say would be a good rule of thumb for any school. But high-tech high brings a lot of other stuff to the table. You want to measure all those other things, but particularly when you're dealing with these alternative populations, what are the more qualitative, mission-oriented things that the school has to show that it's doing so that you know whether it's doing a good job with those kids and not just warehousing them? So there's a lot of new directions that this discussion could probably go in because of that.
Okay, so as some of you know, I have strong opinions on just about everything. But the reason why I was asked to moderate this one, which I'm seldom asked to do, is because I'm torn on this. I actually have no idea what the right answer is. And so part of what I'm going through right now is I'm just trying to answer this stuff for myself. And so the baseline question I have, and I want to turn back to Mike on this, is I have never seen a truly high-performing school that has lousy test scores in math and reading. I've never seen that happen before. So to Charlie's point about just sort of going up, not out, I mean, are you really concerned that there are some schools that look bad on standardized accountability systems, but really are doing great things for kids?
Yes, I do. Absolutely. I mean, but a couple of points on that. First of all, this is off topic, okay? But I do think there are some schools that serve low-income kids or high-need kids that have low proficiency scores, but maybe knocking it out of the park on progress over time. And particularly middle schools and high schools, let's say, who are getting kids in who are already 3 or 4 grade levels behind, they could be making incredible gains with those kids, and they still are not going to hit proficiency on grade level tests. So that's the first point, and that's why I'm a big advocate of saying, look, if states want to just look at progress over time, we should allow that. Okay. Now, I think that aside, sure, if you're talking about an affluent school in the suburbs or other higher performing schools, they may not end up with an F on the state rating because of the test scores, but they might end up with a C, if they're a very progressive school, if they're a Waldorf charter school, if they're doing a lot of project-based learning, they might end up with, mediocre scores. They might end up with a 4 or a 5 on greatschools.net. They're going to have to, and look, and I've always said, hey, you can just explain that away to your customers. You can try to say, hey, we don't focus on the test, and that's why. And maybe that's all you got to worry about. But I do worry about the coercive effect of the tests on schools that are trying to be different, that there just can be a lot of pressure, and the teacher evaluation thing now just adds that much more pressure for them to pay attention to these tests, even if they don't believe in them, and even if their own parents and clients say that, hey, we understand why they're not quite as good. Can I respond to a couple other points? I get it that everybody up here is worried about letting bad schools off the hook, and that's totally legitimate. I worry about that too. Now, granted, in the public school sector, we still don't really know what to do with these bad schools, and so they get an F for the, okay, nothing ever happens. So I don't know that it matters that much. Do they get an F or do they get a C? We don't know what to do with them anyways. But I feel like that it is a fair criticism of us reformers that we don't worry enough about making good schools look bad. We're so obsessed with allowing bad schools to look good that we don't worry about the opposite. And we should be worried about it. And I think it's something that is demoralizing to educators, to parents, to communities, and that we have, look, the whole premise of standards-based reform and accountability is based on the idea that we're going to use sound metrics, and we're going to be able to make good judgments and differentiate between A schools and F schools and the schools in between. And so, I think we have to be really just as worried about mislabeling the schools at the top as the schools at the bottom. And finally, to Delia's point, I certainly agree that we have to continue to worry about disadvantaged kids, minority kids, but that's not the only kids we should worry about. If schools are using teaching techniques that are not ideal, or they're not what the parents want, they're not what's actually in the best interest of the kids, even kids who are middle-class white kids, I still think that's a problem.
I think you're right, and I was going to point out the fact that I worry about all kids, and in the school you're talking about where, well, maybe they got a C, but they did really well in art, or maybe they're really good in poetry. Why is it okay for that school not to do well in reading and writing, but the school that has all these minority poor kids is going to be punished for not doing as well? So, I mean, your point is that we should look at other measures like growth. Well, I think we're starting to look at those. It's, I'm not going to use another slippery slope, baby with the bathwater. We need to look at standards, and we need to apply the same standards across the board. And that's not equity when you say, well, that school, the parents really only care about whether their children are creative or artistic, so it's okay that they're going to get a C on this, so maybe we shouldn't measure them. Well, the principal in the other school is going to say, but my kids are safe, and I've really grown, and they've really changed. But it's not okay for them to get a C. So we really need to look at those standards from a different perspective. Are they equitable?
So I was struck by a recent study, I think maybe Paul Peterson and his team did it, showing that like over 20 years, I think, states that were really faithful in their accountability systems, like Maryland and Massachusetts and Florida, were the ones that made some serious gains. Ed Sector, that's right, John Chubb and so forth. So a part of me is just thinking, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, it seems like if you go about accountability in this way for a long period of time, you can start to close achievement gaps and do right by kids. Well, so I want to get Charlie back in here because he was there at the founding with NCLB. He was a staffer for George Miller, 2001, 2002, when all this stuff was happening. So do you feel like the conversation has changed about accountability and what we need to measure, or is this just sort of like the DC crowd talking about this? Like, how are things different today in the debate than 10 years ago when we were doing this?
Well, here was the deal that got pitched 10 years ago. The government would do less to dictate to schools what their policies had to be, as long as the schools met certain outcomes. Now the debate is, well, maybe they don't have to meet the same outcomes. So that's one way the debate has changed. You know, that was the deal. That was the deal with charters. We're going to give them flexibility to run their programs the way they want to and not have to abide by district-wide agreements around labor and not have to follow the same budget procedures as districts, but we were going to hold them, their feet to the fire on outcomes. And now that this stuff has kicked in for other folks, not everybody likes it. I mean, no one likes to be held accountable. It's not a lot of fun always. Here's the other thing I would add, though. Hey, not everything's fun. Learning algebra, not fun. If we could all get out of learning algebra and succeed in life, we would, but we had to do it. And it won't come up very highly on Joshua Starr's good feeling, survey. You're not going to be feeling good when you're trying to learn calculus. It's just the way it works. But let me throw one other thing in here. Mike makes a really good theoretical argument. We're always trying to balance uniformity against innovation. But on this one, the history's pretty clear. Most of the creativity has been around how to game the system. And the politics against making clear comparisons were brutal. I mean, you want to talk about NCLB. Now, everybody says, well, the one thing we all love that we all know was great was disaggregation of data. So you were around for some of this, Fritz. That wasn't an easy fight, man. We took that thing to the floor 3 or 4 times and had people vote against it. You had testing psychometricians who knew it was the right thing to do from a quantitative standpoint, but didn't like the politics because they were from a school of education that didn't believe in accountability, coming in and fighting against it. So these are all hard-won fights. Same with the graduation. We just got to the point where everybody's supposed to use the same graduation rate measure. It took 7 years from the time NGA proposed that till everybody adopted it. Well, until last year when the U.S. Department of Education decided to let a few states off the hook for how to do it. Look at some of these expected value growth models that SAS and Pearson are using. They're very complicated, and they're not what you're told they are. There are a lot of details in there that don't quite do what people promise. All I'm saying is, I'm all for a utopia where people get really creative and come up with these wonderful measures of accountability that reflect what students should know and be able to do and what schools are doing well. But that's not the history around this stuff. It just isn't. And the politics around this are very real. If you don't attend to those, we're going to start to have, some of the things Daley's talking about, because that's what we've had in the past. So that's just the reality of this.
Okay, so, in Washington, D.C., we have these conversations like navel gazing, big think, and they might not catch root. Why this is so important, I think, is because Congress right now is trying to reauthorize ESEA. So they're thinking about what the federal government's role in accountability is. States, 30 plus of them now have ESEA waivers, so they've been thinking about what new accountability systems look like, and many of them have to re-up with the federal government. Charter authorizers are always thinking about this subject. How do you do these contracts? So this is a meaningful subject right now. It's timely. This could have an influence. So rather than thinking about all the reasons why not to do it, I want to push on the not whether, but if so, how. Because we actually want to give some guidance to the people who are making these policies. So let me just put Robin in this awkward position. Say the gods of education came down to you and said, all right, we're going to go in this direction. It's going to be best for everybody. You get to decide what this is going to look like. You can give us some contours or put up some guardrails. What should we do? How should we go begin down this path? Or what shouldn't we do?
I'm morally opposed to this question. It was a lot more fun to pick on Mike's idea than to come up with our own ideas. I think, so I guess I want to go, but I think that it was useful, Charlie's point, about, really kind of taking a look at the backlash question and trying to understand it. And I think, there are the accountability haters out there, but there are some people with legitimate gripes. And so as we think about the next generation of accountability systems, I think it's right to think about fine-tuning. And I think if you were to build in some kind of opt-out or safety valve, you should do it in a tiered way. So you should start with, I just can't, for reasons of research, for reasons of just general transparency, I can't give up on the idea that all schools should have to take the same tests so that we know what's going on out there. But
can I press on that for just a second?
Yeah.
So there is a difference between, I guess, we could call transparency metrics and accountability metrics. So I think Mike might say they all have to take the test and they all have to publicize the scores, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to do interventions or some activities based on those scores.
yeah.
Or even a rating, A through F. So they have to
Right.
take the test, publicize the scores, but they're going to be held accountable for different metrics.
Right. So, I think that you can imagine in a place like Colorado that does growth as well as proficiency as a way to sort schools. You could imagine that Colorado might use that sorting mechanism as a first-tier sort of triage approach to interventions. And so use the test scores to sort the schools and say, we've got potentially some problem schools down here in the low-growth, low-proficiency area. We've got some potentially high flyers up here. Let's think about some strategies for going the next tier down with the low guys and figuring out, send in some school review teams, figure out some other metrics about what's going on, and decide whether we have the capacity to, God forbid we try to turn them around, but to do something about closing the schools or some sort of intervention, or there's something that's salvageable here that we can keep going. And that more nuanced kind of look at what's going on, I think you could have charter legislation, for example, that has an automatic closure mode for the lowest performing schools, but a second tier look to see for the lowest 10% or something that have special populations, whether there is some rigorous justifiable reason, but you have a really, really strict process that defines terms and doesn't let schools off the hook.
Great. So yeah, I'd like to get Nelson in here because several careers ago, he was the first authorizer, the first ED of the DC Public Charter School Board. So he has some good experience knowing what it's actually like to try to develop school-based, one-by-one contracts with schools. So is there real promise in this? Maybe we have a deal with all of these schools in Montgomery County or elsewhere. Fine. You can opt out, but now you have a charter contract. If you don't do well enough, you get shut down.
Yes and no. Going back to my experience in D.C., when we first started and we had just a very few schools, you could actually construct very specific accountability agreements with every school that were very mission specific, had a few common elements, but were really tailored to every single school. There are now 100 charter schools in D.C. You can't do that anymore. It's almost impossible as simply an administrative matter to tailor each one that carefully to each school. So you have to have a pretty much common body of metrics that you're using. I guess the question for me is what is the relationship of the test-based information to your outcomes and what you're trying to do? Why do you give tests? Well, you give tests for accountability purposes. You give tests so that it informs instruction, and that's the thing that the state tests have tended not to be any good for up till now. But you also give tests to figure out, are the kids learning the stuff that's supposed to be learned? And it's hard for me to see how you can embrace the Common Core and then say, well, yeah, but we'll take these, and these kids out, or let their parents, because they're progressives, and they're worried about their kids not experiencing the magic garden of childhood enough, or whatever. They don't have to be a part of the pool. If you're going to, in fact, just say that there is a Common Core of learning that should happen, I think you have to pretty much arguably get everybody into it with very, very well defined, very well carved out exceptions for the kind of populations we've been talking about.
So actually, I want to push on that one point, this idea that now that there are 100 charters that, because of a scale problem, DC, the Public Charter School Board really can't fine-tune, go one by one. Is that just an issue of scale? Like we need more authorizers to do this?
Well, there's always a mission element in any charter oversight. And again, the question comes back to what do you do about it? Yeah. To take the high-tech high example, their mission is pretty clear and it's imbued throughout the whole school. I don't know exactly how their contract is written, but no one's going to close down high-tech high because they don't test all that well. They do other things and document it well in all sorts of other areas. So we're kind of now learning the art of documenting other things that don't derive from standardized tests. You know, not just graduation rate, but things like attrition, things like incidents of disciplinary actions, things like post-secondary attainment. Do the kids actually get into college and then 4 years later graduate? I mean, there's a whole new set of measures that are coming online that aren't test-related, except, you know, 3 or 4 steps away.
So that actually makes me wonder if Mike is right about this. We might be in a transition period. I'm trying to add some ballast here. Everyone's beating up on Mike. I was trying to take a side. Maybe we're in a transition period. We're realizing that the old school accountability systems aren't right. These new metrics are coming online, and what we need to do now is experiment. Take, I don't know, call it 5 years worth of time to allow states and districts to do this kind of thing, and then reassess come 2018 and say whether or not this made sense, and then create new federal state policies around it. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I definitely think there's an argument at the federal level for flexibility so that states can experiment. I'd also say, you know, unless you think I'm just trying to be provocative, Alexander Russo called me an internet troll today. What's up with that? We like to call ourselves gadflies here at Fordham, not trolls. Anyways, but you know, that Kevin Carey, even what was it, maybe a year ago, wrote about high school accountability and how we should now be getting to the point where instead of looking at these test scores, which are these, you know, these sort of kind of interim indicators, and especially at the high school level where it's so hard to, you know, if kids are coming in way far behind to get a good measure of what the school's value added is to look at outcomes like graduation and like college going, and like eventually we can look at employment outcomes. I mean, we are getting to this point where we can look at the things that actually we care about. I mean, the test scores have always been a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is if kids do well on these tests, that will lead to success in the real world. And I think, you know, there's reasons to believe that hypothesis. It's not, you know, we don't know it for 100%. Okay, but if we can instead measure the actual outcomes we care about, then we should do that. Now, that might be more doable for high schools than for other schools. But you know, so what I again would say is, you know, give schools this opportunity to present other data. This could be a part. For example, what if a state said, okay, we've got our regular accountability system. We're going to look at the test scores. We've got our algorithm. Come out with A to F, and then schools in an appeal process can say, well, we think we deserve a higher grade than you gave us, and let us show you these additional data points that we think should allow us to get bumped up a grade because of these other. I think that would be legitimate. One more point to Charlie's thing, and I understand it's kind of this tough talk, and these people didn't want accountability, and now people don't like accountability. Look, here's the moral question. Who decides what a good school is? Okay, do we decide in Washington? Do state policymakers decide? And what is the role of minorities, not minority groups in the way we usually, but minority views, okay? What is the role of parents who say, you know what, I look at the Common Core, and that's not where I'm at. That's not, you know, I want something different for my kids. How much room will there be in the public education system for schools to be different? Now, you could say, look, if it's taxpayer-funded education, I'm sorry, you got to put up with what the taxpayers want. And that is one argument. But if we believe in school choice, I think we have to acknowledge that there's a real tension here and that there is some role in allowing parents to have some say and to have, you know, so that, look, and you're listening to a guy who spends a lot of time lately on conservative talk radio defending the Common Core, okay? And the argument from the right is, you know, why not just trust the parents? You know, why one size fits all? Why is this coming down from above? You know, not just about national standards, but any kind of standards. And there is a real tension here. And so what I'm trying to do is to find some creative ways to resolve that tension rather than just to cover our ears and say, la, 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 we are on the right side of this issue because we care about kids.
I don't know about you, but while Mike was talking, I was, I agree with that. No, I disagree. And I went back and forth between agreeing and disagreeing. So I'll start where I was disagreeing, but there was a lot of agreement there. I sort of recoil at the word experiment. Our kids aren't lab rats, and we've got to stop experimenting. We have been on a steady path toward finding an answer, I believe, through legislation for this country. And I don't think we have to stop and change things and experiment. I think we need to get it right. I think that we need to be about tweaking and figuring out how to finesse this. I mean, if DC public schools or DC charter schools now has problems sort of creating specialized agreements with 100 schools, Think about state education agencies who don't have the capacity and who are working with 1,000 schools. What are we going to do about that? We need to figure out how we keep the standards, how we keep accountability, and how we make it work instead of continuing to experiment.
So I want to get Robin back in here because SERPI, where she has worked for quite some time, former director Paul Hill, came up with this idea that now is in vogue, but this idea of portfolio management, getting the district leadership out of the business of running schools and into the business of just overseeing schools operated by others. So get out of rowing, get into steering. So I'm wondering if this portfolio management system actually that your organization has been advocating for quite some time, if this isn't kind of leading in Mike's direction. That is, the district's leadership just has these agreements with all of its schools, says operate as you want to, and then has customized accountability plans for each one.
Just the opposite. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, we work with about 40 districts around the country, and the idea is that they're going to become neutral about the label. They'll work with charter schools if it makes sense. They'll work with district-run schools if it makes sense. But their main role, the role of the school board, is only to manage performance and close down schools that don't work and open more that do. And in order to do that, what they're coming to is common performance frames between charter schools and district-run schools, because they can't very well say that there's going to be a different standard between the two sectors. And that's really hard work. It's taking them lots of conversations with the charter people who are arguing, you know, but we're different, but we're different, but we're different. But that's all good. You know, they're deciding that as a city, there's going to be some common standard, and it's not going to be different for different types of kids or anything like that. That if you're really going to manage performance, you have to have some common frame. Now, that said, I think that what they are also learning is that they haven't been good performance managers in the past. And in the ways that Nelson described, they have to get much more sophisticated about how they then use that, the standards and the data to make decisions about closure, none of which are easy. But having that common frame puts everybody on a level playing field and breaks down those barriers between sectors, I think.
So let me ask Mike this question, and then maybe we can open up to some questions on Twitter, and maybe for...
Call me, Mr. Troll.
No. So I don't want to call anyone out by name, but there are Hill staffers here, and they are thinking about accountability stuff. So you work for the U.S. Department of Education. I mean, right now we're in the nonprofit sector, and we can throw out ideas, but then some people go back to their offices, and they actually have to do this stuff. They have to write policy. They have to write regulations, write legislation. You're talking to them right now. What should section for the wonks in here, 1111 and 1116 of ESCA, the accountability provisions, how should they be changed in this next iteration to get at what you're getting at?
See Lamar Alexander's bill and copy and paste. I mean, it's there. I mean, look, it's frankly, from the federal level, sure. I mean, I would support the Republican approach, which says that states there has to be testing. The results have to be released. They have to be released by these subgroups, and there has to be some kind of accountability system that results in a school rating. And they have to pay attention to achievement gaps. Period. Right. And it's up to the states. And I think if that provides enough flexibility for a state to experiment with some of these other kinds of things that I'm proposing here, and I think that on the whole that would be quite effective.
Where then does opt-out happen in that process? Are you saying because they, for example, can create indexes, which a lot of states are doing even under their waivers now, that would accommodate enough different items for a given school that you could sort of replace the influence of the tests?
I guess what I'm saying, I think I'd have to look at the exact language. If it still says there must be a uniform accountability system, and that is taken to mean, everybody the same way, okay, we might need to tweak it a little bit. But I would just say, the fewer the words, the better. And to be interpreted as allowing whatever's not required, the states are allowed to experiment with. Another approach, if people aren't comfortable with that, and of course this is all hypothetical, right? This isn't going to happen anytime soon. No offense to the Hill staffers who need something to do, but the
hope springs eternal.
Yes, that there could also be some kind of waiver process or encouraging waivers. Think of the welfare to work years of saying, hey, we really want to see more innovation, okay? I mean, my big beef with the waiver process is that it hasn't allowed enough flexibility, right? states that want to just look at value added and not look at status have not been allowed to do that, for example. You know, if a state wanted to try this kind of stuff we've talked about here today, I don't think they could, right? So I think that should go further and actually encourage states, hey, give us a proposal, set up a way to measure it, to track it, to see how it goes, and let's let a couple of states give this a try.
All right, so Charlie, imagine I'm a state chief, and you're working in the U.S. Department of Education, and we're under the current ESEA waiver application. There is the top tier of schools that states have to identify called reward schools, the top performers. I'm a state chief. I submit a waiver to you and your friends at the Department of Education saying, what we're going to do with our reward schools is earned autonomy. They have proven themselves to be great for years and years and years, and we're going to go down Mike's path. All of a sudden, they don't have to be held accountable in the same ways because they've proven themselves. Those top 10% of schools, they can come up with their own contracts with the SEA, and we'll see where it goes. What would you say?
Trying to be nice here.
Don't be.
I just find that things in the education world are completely upside down from everywhere else, and I don't understand it. If you went to your doctor and you had really good cholesterol readings, your doctor would say, great, keep up the good work, see me next year. Not, don't come back for 10 years, you're doing great. I mean, things don't work that way in real life. You're basing this year's rating on a particular set of people at that school, on a particular set of demographics and policies, all of which could change over the course of a few years. You need to monitor what's happening at that school. And, you know, when you don't trust something, you can try to control it. And I think that's part of the dynamic that's going on here is a lot of us that have been around this aren't sure we trust the system to do the right thing. So we're trying to control the outcome so that we at least get a handle on what's really going on. And I think, you know, one way this could change is if the system helped build up its own trust. And I don't think that's going to happen from the federal government level, but the debate we're having here is incredibly simplistic. I don't mean here, but around testing. Testing's good or testing's bad. That's the debate. Charters are good or charters are bad. Common Core is good or Common Core is bad. Those are the wrong questions. You know, those are what you call distal variables in the research world. They're very far removed from what actually has an impact on the outcomes that you're trying to look at. In this 12 years, we've had very little discussion about what do these state tests measure. The reading tests, what do they measure well? What do they not measure well? Which aspects of reading comprehension and writing are we not measuring well by these tests? And which are we really measuring well? We haven't had that discussion for a lot of reasons, and we won't get into them here, but that's the kind of discussion you need to have to figure out where you're going to go next on assessments. I pick out reading because it's a lot different than math in terms of trying to influence the outcomes. And so until we have those kinds of conversations, to me, we're not informed well enough to know what should be the same as it is now and what should be different. But it's not happening in the education world. You have an economist like Raj Chetty who's finding that actually the tests we have now predict some things over the long term that involve both achievement and social outcomes, like teenage pregnancy. So they're measuring something valid. This knee-jerk reaction, well, everybody's upset, so we have to get rid of them. Well, you know, we're in education. You're supposed to be informed about what it is that you're pursuing. I just think we need a more informed approach, and it involves people at the local level sort of stepping up and being substantive rather than reactive to an emotional level that could be quelled in other ways than just jettisoning everything we're doing now.
Okay, so do we have microphones for the crowd in case they want to ask? Oh, that one. Okay, before we do that, there's a really interesting Twitter issue here related to something that Delia said, and there are two camps emerging, and I'd like to give her a chance to respond to this. The one camp just loves this line about our kids are not lab rats. We cannot experiment on our kids. The other camp is saying something interesting, which is actually we have not yet closed the achievement gap. Low-income kids all across America still are not achieving at the same levels after 50 years of work. How in the world are we going to figure out how to serve those kids better if we don't experiment? What say you?
I say I agree with both camps. I'm not talking about experimenting with, I'm talking about experimenting with accountability systems, not with kids. We do have to have innovation. And part of what I was talking about is let's stick to this. Let's figure out the ways that work. Let's not change the measures. Let's not change what we're holding schools accountable for, but let's innovate in what we're doing to help these kids. So yes, we do have to experiment, but we have to hold schools to the same standard. So while we're experimenting, we're not losing a whole generation of kids because we're trying something different in terms of accountability.
I think, can we get Fritz? You have a question? Up front here.
Fritz Edelstein. Welcome to the Education Conundrum. I thought there was some middle ground coming up, and the question starts: why not? Why not take what Robin was talking about in tiering, utilizing the Common Core, and then have a second tier of metrics, which you were talking about, Mike, to think about if there's an appeal process or looking at it, asking some of those smarter questions that we haven't asked in education, and that we never asked in even looking at Title I. Like, has the graduation rate for that population improved over time? Or have they gone to college at greater rates? And things like that, which you're asking. So we move it down, granted there's conflict on the Common Core. But if we ask a second tier of questions that relate to what kids know or are able to do, depending on grade levels and stuff, and where they're going to go over time, we then build a better conversation that Charlie's talking about.
Yeah, why not? I agree.
Yeah.
Say a word about that. One of the things that I think the whole system could learn from some of the alternative schools is the notion of testing for mastery. When you have a kid who's only there for 2 months or 4 months at a time, they have to develop certain kinds of standards-aligned modules that the kid can master. And then you go on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So you don't have this blunt instrument that falls once a year for the test date. You find out, are they actually learning what they're supposed to be learning? If we did that, you could solve a lot of different problems at the same time. I mean, the problem of the kids who are not challenged in the upper grades. If you find out that by sophomore year they've completed all they have to complete under the Common Core, the school can be free to do anything it wants as supplement, as enrichment, and so forth. So, I mean, I think, I'd like to think that a decade or two from now we'll have a really different notion of what testing is and how you do it and what its place is in terms of the whole accountability spectrum.
Other questions? Has Mike convinced you all?
I'm Jeremy Ayers. I'm with the House Committee on Education and Workforce. So I have a question. It seemed like this is an empirical question. Mike, you're putting out an issue that we think about a lot, and that is misidentification of schools. And your premise is that they're high-flying schools that have good outcomes that are not measured by reading and math. And the example used was High Tech High, saying college going rates. But I think, as we all know, it's much easier to get into college than it is to be successful there or stay there, right? Which is why we've now defined college and career readiness as not needing remediation. So some of these kids can get into school and they need remedial classes, they don't stay there. So have we really accomplished much for them if we let schools, quote unquote, off the hook for that? The other example used is growth, and the one example I think that we have at the federal level is the growth model pilot, right? And apparently what I understand, because I'm a little young for this, but I was around, is that the adding growth didn't necessarily get you more schools off the hook. Often schools that don't have great proficiency rates also don't have great growth rates. And so now under the waivers, when you can add in growth, it seems to me ample flexibility and experimentation in the good way on this. So it seems to me at the heart, my question is, do we really have empirical evidence, and point me to if I'm wrong, that we have these quote-unquote high-flying schools that just happen to not have good reading and math test scores?
No, great questions.
Or grad rates. So.
First of all, I would say I don't think they have to be high-flying per se. I mean, the question is, are they good versus bad? It doesn't mean they're going to be great, right? And it's a good question. I think we could try to find that out. And I do think we're going to find some. I mean, you look at those growth models back in the early growth models. Again, it depends how you measure growth. The problem under No Child Left Behind is that there's been this requirement that kids have to be tested at grade level. All right. Now, that was an equity thing. That was a make sure we're not lowering our standards thing. The problem is if you're 4 grade levels behind at the beginning of the year and you're 2 grade levels behind at the end of the year, these tests under No Child Left Behind aren't going to pick that up. They're not going to have a clue. You have to actually have an adaptive test, like Smarter Balance is moving towards, or Northwest Evaluation Association. You've got to have some way for the test to actually test that kid and say, actually, they're coming in at a 2nd grade level, and at the end of the year, they were at a 4th grade level, and give the school credit for that. And we have not been able to do that under No Child Left Behind. So no, they're not doing that now. They're still not doing it today. Nobody's doing it today because there is still a requirement, my understanding is, that the No Child Left Behind tests have to be given at grade level. Okay, this is why some states wanted to use NWEA, which is a computer adaptive test, and we're not allowed, okay, because the department said, no, you have to be tested in grade level material. All right, so we still could have schools out there that are showing, maybe not great gains, but solid gains for kids coming in way behind, and we don't know. All right, now, if they give the NWEA and can show that, they should be able to present that in an appeal. Right? Certainly, that's how it works now in the charter school space. I think that does happen, where a charter school is threatened with closure, and they say, hey, we don't look good in the state test, but look at our NWEA results, and we can show you our growth. I'm saying that should be allowed in the public setting as well. So I think let's just be careful. We have not nailed this yet. And I do think, and I'd love to test it empirically, that there are some schools out there that are, making good progress and are still ending up with a big fat F on their cover.
How's it going? All right. My name is Sean Johnson. I'm a college professor, former elementary teacher. Just a quick show of hands. How many people in this room have actually taught in a classroom? Awesome. Okay, great. Love all my educators out there. All right. I think there's sort of a profound misunderstanding within this community of the work that teachers actually do. And I think we tend to get in the weeds a little bit about accountability and test-based reforms that don't match the realities of everyday classrooms, number one. Number two, as a person who's leading opt-out movements myself, I think there's a misunderstanding of what opt-out means from a progressive standpoint. So for someone like myself, opting out is an act of civil disobedience against the corporate-style reforms that put profits over students. And that's one of my fundamental problems with this. So they're like what's happening in Chicago right now, where 54 schools are being closed despite the wishes of the community. So opting out, at least in my circles that I run with, tends to be more along the lines of an act of civil disobedience against much wealthier interests. I don't have a budget. I don't have any funders. I don't have grants. I'm just an educator. And so I think that's the other part of opting out that should be taken into account here. Thanks.
Great. Back there. Actually, let me interject a question here and see how you guys react to this. Maybe we're having a conversation and like the world has passed us by. So in Louisiana, John White, the state chief down there, is trying to launch this thing called course choice. So rather than having school choice, school by school by school, like disaggregating what it means to be a school. So having kids be able to decide, I'm going to take a course this way online, or take a course in some school here or another school there. So we have this accountability system that actually may not match what the world is going to look like, especially as we go more blended and more online and so forth. Maybe it's time to kind of put these old school accountability systems, put them on pause and allow this stuff to play out. What do you think?
It'd be kind of nice to move there. I mean, one thing I would say is I think one of the tensions around testing is, and nobody really knows how pervasive this is, but there are schools where kids are, locked in a classroom and made to do test prep for long periods of time. That's pretty ugly. Kids sitting down to take 2 days of tests with a number 2 pencil and fill in bubbles. That's pretty ugly. It doesn't have to be done that way in the future. It really doesn't. Robin brought this up in our online conversation, so I don't want her to think I'm stealing it from her, but it's something I've thought about for a long time. You can have embedded assessments that are built right into the work you're doing, and I think, you were talking about course completion assessments, and that's the kind of thing I think we could move to. And as kids become more mobile, that's going to have to be done online and probably in a more piecemeal fashion. And that's probably a reality we're going to have to deal with, because Florida's moved the same way in terms of where kids can get their credits, and some kids are going on college campuses and having dual enrollment. But that's a smarter way of doing assessment. It's not getting rid of the assessment. It's taking the pressure off and some of the ugliness out of it, so it's just part of the kids' normal schoolwork, and you can get both the undergrade level and the grade level stuff in there. I mean, it's a much nicer system, and you can build tutorials into the assessments and all other kinds of things that people are working on now, that may look good in 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, so I just want to say, yes, I agree. We've been working with New York City in their iZone, and they're doing a ton of experimentation with schools on mastery-based learning, where tests are becoming embedded in the kids' day, and kids are moving just as fast as they can to get there. And so, I do think that we need to think about the accountability of the future and what that means. When you wed yourself to grade level tests, I think you bound yourself in sort of unfortunate ways. When you ask schools to take a lot of risks on a new model, as New York City is doing for some of their schools, you probably need to give them a break for a year or something, so that they can kind of work through the kinks to get there, rather than slapping them with a, you're failing kind of a mode. And you have to think about, I think, teacher and school accountability on a different level. So teachers are not any longer doing all the instruction themselves. So what are we holding them accountable for? They're becoming, as a school, is becoming kind of a manager of a portfolio of learning for the kids. So.
Sorry,
And from outside the pillar. Bridget Kelly with City Year. So California core, the district waiver. Sorry, so some California districts proposed their own district waiver, and that included some social emotional measures in the index. And so I was just interested in whether you think that kind of alternative to test-based assessments might hold some promise for potentially catching some of those schools that maybe are helping students in other ways that are not being reflected in the assessment.
Yeah. That's a good example of one of those measures that may sound a little touchy-feely, and yet they're very useful for the schools. And I think we have to make a distinction between the kinds of things that you can aggregate up to the level of the state or the nation that tell us how the whole system's doing, which tend to be very standard measures, and the kind of things that you might want to do within an individual school or an individual system to tell you other things. Charlie, you've kind of dissed the HOPE survey a couple of times. That's actually, it's a Gallup survey that's been administered to, I think, 500,000 kids in the last year. And it actually tracks outcomes more closely than the SAT does, in different readiness indicators. But it's a sort of thing that you wouldn't use as a national measure. What you do use it for, particularly in alternative settings, is finding out what is the issue that this kid is grappling with, and what are their own feelings of readiness for the next step that they have to go to. So it's the kind of thing educators would love. It's questionable to me whether you can use some of those things in a gross way for accountability. We'll see what happens in California if it works on a grander scale. The laboratories of democracy here.
Let me go back a little bit to respond to the opt-out comment over here. And I would not, I'm not going to team up with this, I guess, progressive version of opting out. I guess I'm representing the conservative version of opting out. But one benefit here is, frankly, I do want to call the bluff of some of the people who are against reforms and against testing. And I want to say, okay, you hate testing, and we all know testing is imperfect. Okay, so show me other measures that you're willing to be held accountable for that have to do with real outcomes for kids. Okay, so let's say for high schools, again, this is easier. Are you willing to be held accountable for getting more kids into credit-bearing courses as freshmen, or graduating with some kind of degree or certification? Or if we're able to track this over the long term, show that 5 years out the kids are employed in decent-paying jobs. What are you willing to be held accountable for? And maybe some will say, yeah, I'm up for that. Or they may say, well, you have to understand that I really, these kids, and they're coming in and they're so far behind, and there's poverty, or there's complicated in their lives, or dysfunctional, and there's really, there's not much we can do about impacting those kinds of things. And then we have called the bluff that says, in fact, it's not testing that's the problem. It's being willing to be held accountable for any outcomes. And I think that would be a useful conversation for us to have.
Robin?
Quick response. I mean, I think you're right, Mike, in the sense of, it's time for us to kind of, take those concerns seriously and call bluffs. But I think if it's if it's the right thing to do, why not do it for all of our schools, right? So, why just 10%? If the tests aren't measuring the right things, can we as a community, decide if we've got the wrong tests or we've got the wrong accountability measures? Fine, but let's hold fast to some idea of a common school.
So I'm told that this hashtag of ours is trending in DC. This is actually a big deal right now. Yeah, probably in DC only. So I hate to keep coming back to this issue of like the policymakers here, but I mean, I'm a conservative, but I've worked for 5 different government agencies. I mean, that doesn't really happen all that often. And all I can think about right now is this kind of sounds good, but how do we like operationalize this? So let's just do show of hands, first of all, like 2 broad camps. I just want to see where we're oriented. Camp 1 is Mike is crazy. We just need to, we have to test reading, math. We have to stay as is, and then maybe just do sort of like the add-ons, like Charlie would say. That's camp 1. Camp 2 is we don't know nearly enough about this. We need to experiment a little bit. Let's give some freedom, flexibility to some set of schools, especially the high performers. Let's just see where you shake out. You can't vote twice, and you have to vote. So, camp 1, the Mike is crazy. Hands up high. And I will note that the Fordham staff is part. Okay, how about camp 2? That we got to give this a try. You guys are sheepish. Put your heads up high. Let me see. All right. So, any other questions related to this? Okay. This is. No, this speaks volumes, Mike. I don't think you've convinced people. The lesson for policymakers here is,
Hi, I'm Mark Sobolski. I'm a legislative educational consultant. Answering what Mr. Verrilli just said, are you aware of the research that ETS has done of the impact on poverty on education? Would you be willing to listen to that in terms of a reasonable response to the fact that, testing is not going to necessarily bring all ships to the same level? That it is a major, incredible bar to overcome, and that for many teachers, in fact, in the realms in which we are speaking here, the relative impact of that is enormous, and then the relative gains that are made. We're talking about closing the gaps, right? And what Mr. Smith talked about, Daly was talking about, child's not just a test score, neither is a school, neither is a teacher. Let me get to it. Would you be willing to accept that, though, as a possibility of something that, relatively speaking, now that you're bringing in the exceptions to the rule, that must also remain an exception to the rule?
Right. So my understanding of the question is, am I willing to acknowledge that poverty is a serious issue and a serious challenge? And absolutely. And I think if you read what I was writing with this debate with Deborah, but there is bluffing going on, okay? Because the question is not, let me answer. All right, I don't think anybody in the reform movement thinks that schools are going to magically erase these enormous socioeconomic gaps we have between the most affluent kids and the poorest kids in terms of, suddenly we're going to have just as many low-income kids going to, highly competitive colleges 12 years later. If they do believe that, they're nuts, okay? All right, if they really believe that. But I don't, I think you'll find very few people. The question is, how much progress can we make? Okay, so we all know that kids born into poverty have, all this odds stacked against them on all kinds of outcomes. And those of us in education reform and many people in broader movements and social policy movements from pre-K to everything else, are trying to say, how can we improve outcomes for poor kids? Now, it's not going to erase all those challenges, but can we make progress? And so so much of the conversation, the anti-reform conversation is, picking on what's wrong with testing. And some of those are very legit. And I think that the Common Core addressed some of them because they're going to be better tests. They're not going to, the test prep stuff that we see, it's just not going to work. right? They're going to actually have to teach kids well. But I still think that the fair question is, are schools making progress? Are they doing, significantly better than they would be if they weren't making a real effort to teach well? And so my examples on the high school thing was say, all right, look at your scores. You say right now, half the kids are dropping out of our high school, and very few of them are ending up with high-paying jobs or with certificates. Can we move those numbers? Not to 100%, but can we move them? And if you're not willing to say, yes, we will show over time that we're going to move those numbers in the right direction, then I think you're not serious about being held accountable for results.
Other questions? I have one that I want to, yes, right over here, but let me pose something to Nelson first. Or actually all of you. Imagine counterfactual, that when NCLB was passed, that there wasn't this charter bargain that charters have to take part in the exact same accountability system, that in fact over the past 10, 12 years, we would have had charter schools not having to do sections 1111, 1116, they would just have agreements with their authorizers. And that means we would have had 12 years of experiments figuring out what types of accountability systems might be better than the ones we have right now. In hindsight, did we make a mistake by not carving out, like Mike said, 12 years worth of possibilities of learning a whole lot?
The reason we're only trending in DC is because you keep using phrases like 1111 and 1116. Come on, Andy.
That's right. No, I don't think we made a mistake, and here's why. If we had made that bargain instead of the one that we did, instead of having 6,000 charter schools, we'd had maybe 500 around the country, and they'd be cute little boutique-y schools on the fringes, and really kind of private schools. Because we've argued for all these years that charter schools are public schools, fully public. And the acid test for that is that they are accountable through the same systems that all of the public schools are. They have more operational flexibility, but they're not exempt from the measures that tell whether the system is working or not. And you may recall that we changed the name of that organization we both used to work for to the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, simply to make that point. So along with that comes public funding, comes occasionally access to buildings, but it also really allowed charter schools to be seen as part of the public school system and to get such a foothold. So I think it was both, if you want to put it this way, morally correct in terms of being fully held accountable for what they were doing, but also it was absolutely politically necessary.
Hi, yeah, Alyssa Chinovsky, I'm an MPP student at Duke University, and something I worry about is the fact that the conversation about accountability might be kind of dragging us away from talking about interventions. I know that was briefly mentioned earlier, and I guess my question is, are there places, I know the capacity of a lot of state departments, a lot of charter school authorizers, et cetera, don't have the capacity to carry through on interventions when they find these failing schools. So what is the future of interventions? Are you concerned about it? Are there places that are doing interventions right that we could learn from?
I think that's a great question. Let me just add to it. I'd love to hear from all of the panel members on this. Having worked in the State Department of Education, this was on the top of my mind every single day. Here we are, the State Department of Education, in charge of implementing accountability systems. And how in the world are we supposed to deal with 600 districts and, I don't know, 2,000 schools? It is a major question. So I guess to all of us, even when we have these accountability systems, identification is one thing, but then the what then becomes the big issue. Mike, maybe start off and have the rest.
Hi. Turnarounds, right, Andy? Isn't that the answer? We need turnarounds. The school improvement grants program, I think, is going to figure this one out. All right. No, look, I mean, this is tough. I mean, we have. I mean, all I would say is I think that I don't see a lot of evidence that we know what we're doing when it comes to interventions. And so to me, the correct policy response is humility, particularly at the federal level. And so we've got to be, willing to let people continue to experiment. Now, I think you could argue that some of what's happened in Chicago and some other places are these are interventions in a way. Now they're combining with economic issues, okay? But the schools that are getting closed down tend to be schools that are low performing or that have low student population, which means that parents have voted with their feet. And so for one, for better or for worse, we are seeing some significant interventions. It's called closing down schools.
I don't think the feds can do it. I mean, we had this discussion I just don't think the feds can dictate the interventions or monitor them very well. And as you hear from Andy, the states can't necessarily do it either. It's too big. One thing I will say, though, is it's interesting. We touched on this at the beginning of the panel. States that embarked on state systemic reform, where they set high standards and they aligned it with teacher training and curricula, and they didn't do the bell and whistle stuff, they're the states that are progressing on the outcomes that we're looking at. So when you tell people that operate in the ed reform bubble, well, it's the Marylands and the Massachusetts and the Delawares of the world that have been showing a lot of gains. You're like, what? They're not doing anything there. Well, they're doing the sort of grunt work of making a system work without a big splash or necessarily always conflict. There are exceptions to that. I mean, Louisiana is breaking China and they're showing good results. But a lot of the work is not flashy, and it's not, a one-shot deal where you're going to intervene in one school. It's having a system work and be integrated, and that's where we're trying to get with Common Core. And then we put in a plug here. I'm worried that we're spending so much time worrying about whether or not states adopt it, that all those other things aren't going to be aligned and coordinated in a good way, because everybody's shooting all the resources at whether or not it's adopted. Andy had a blog series earlier this year where he said, and then a miracle happens? Yeah. And I just think that everybody has to be mindful of that, because this is a long haul project to do sort of what's boring in a way, systemic reform, but that's what seems to work better than intervening in one school or one government agency trying to monitor one school. It's really a system that you're trying to change.
Sure, I'll just say one quick thing. States just don't have the capacity for the most part to do this, and a lot of them are working on it. The same concepts that we urge at the district level, we urge at the state level. The states have to see their role as being portfolio managers and monitoring whether districts are doing what they need to do, holding them accountable for that. But also thinking about the supply strategy hard. You can't close schools if you don't have a better alternative. And so what's your new school strategy? That's a big part of what Louisiana is doing, I think. How are you going to employ technology to open up new avenues for teachers to extend their reach and be more effective through a lot of different channels? How are you going to reach rural schools that way? And so, yeah, it's complicated business, but the first thing the states have to do is build their capacity, build the people in the central office who can actually do this work, which is often a problem. And I'd argue the feds should be holding states mostly accountable for that. Are the states building that capacity to actually either do school improvement or have a school pipeline strategy that's continuously improving?
We're going to take one more question, so think hard about it.
I think the accountability is at the district level for creating the changes. We can't do it at the federal level. What we can say at the federal level is you must do something. And what the state can do is say, you must do something and we're going to give you some resources. But what we're going to do has to be decided at the local level, where you can build systems, you can train teachers, you can bring parents in and make them partners. And that's the only way it's going to happen. So we've got to start holding districts accountable in a different way.
Hi, this is a real question. My name's Michael from Education Writers Association. So some of the problems that you've all highlighted, or most of you've highlighted, are capacity issues, oversight on the state and federal level, having enough regulators, etc. If capacity is a major issue, why not put add to the debt a little to have enough assessors, to have enough regulators to meet the needs, to actually see through these programs with enough intervention and enough oversight? Or is that just politically unwieldy?
Nelson, do you want to take a crack at it?
Just one quick crack. I'm not so sure that it's a question of the body count, that we don't have enough people to actually do the regulating. I think it's a question of the clarity of the rules. When you have an absolutely clear accountability system and you can make absolutely clear-cut decisions, you don't need that many people to oversee it. But there is a trade-off. If you want to bring levels of nuance into this or make decisions about who doesn't have to take the test or who's an alternative school or whatnot, it gets a little more complicated. If you look at what Colorado did, for example, I think there's a good example of a state that was faced with a very complex issue, which is how to name the alternative schools. And they set a bunch of criteria together, but said your student population has to add up to 95% of students coming from these categories. So that reduced a lot the number of schools who went into that alternative pool. But you rarely see that level of clarity in terms of the actual policy that states have.
All right, everyone wants this reception to begin, including Mike, apparently. I could talk about this all day long. So what I want to do is give everyone one last bite at the apple with this particular thing in mind. Let's not just talk about the world as we want it to be, but as it actually is going to be. So people are here writing ESEA waivers in the future. They're trying to reauthorize law. What is your advice to these folks doing this work? Charlie, let's start with you.
I think the profession of teaching and school administration needs to build its own capacity to do this stuff for themselves so the government doesn't feel compelled to drop in and do it for them. I mean, that's the long-term game for me here. You don't see this in other professions, and there's a reason. There's been an abdication of responsibility on the part of the profession of teaching. They don't design their own assessments. They're not the gatekeepers for their profession. They're not the ones that decide how teachers are evaluated. All teachers give tests. We're not talking about whether or not kids take tests. You know, it's about whether we can rely on the information coming out. And a lot of what we're doing is trying to work around that situation. So the long game for me is fundamentally change the way people are trained as professionals and the attitude and norms they have when they walk into a school about what to do and how to measure things. And all this testing debate will start to recede. I don't see that like happening next year. I mean, I think I'll have a job doing this kind of stuff till I retire, but I think that's the only way that this is going to really become a profession rather than this sort of cat and mouse game that a lot of us are playing now. You see evidence it's starting to happen, but long term, I really think that's the way it has to move, and that's the way every other profession has moved over history. It's just going to take us a while to get there.
All right, Mike, you have a captive audience. Last chance. Change minds.
All right. I would just say that there's a huge difference between 90% and 100%. And I think it would dramatically transform the conversation to say that we're going to have uniformity and a common accountability system for 90% of the schools. And for 10% of the schools, we're going to allow them to do something different. And I certainly think that we should at least allow 10% of the states to give this a try.
That was tweetable. Mike, thanks for raising this. I mean, I think that I still don't agree with you, but I think it makes the point that that at least we need to think about the time is right with ESEA and with the emergence of Common Core. The time is right to just revisit our accountability system and ask these kinds of questions. And I honestly think it would be a huge problem to start a lot of opt-outs because if the system's not working, then we need to just retool it and make sure that it works for kids, not just let some folks out who are kind of the loudest complainers. But it's going to take some leadership to do that, and I think it's time for people to get really courageous in leadership positions and say, we're going to stand behind Common Core, we're going to do it right, and we're not going to walk away from this because it's the right thing to do.
Take the conversation to the community and engage the community. We've done a bad public relations job with assessment for many, many years. And I think if we had started with this as a community conversation where the community and parents understood why this was being proposed, what they could expect, what their responsibility was, and also how they should hold schools responsible and accountable for what's happening, we'd have a very different conversation going on today.
And to go back to our earlier mixed metaphors, my advice would be don't throw the baby out with the bathwater down the slippery slope. You know, I really think right now is a great time to be talking about all this, but maybe not the time to actually do any of it just yet, because with the Common Core coming on and Park and Smarter Balanced, I really do think it's going to really redefine how we think about assessment. And it's going to solve some of the problems that are associated with it. And, you know, so just as we have a lot of turbulence coming up and discussions of taking a pause, I think right now we kind of have to see it through and make it work right, as Robin said, for the kids, because I think that's the, you know, that's the most important thing to think about right now. and err on the side of having everybody covered and making very few exceptions.
Thank you. So I want to have two separate rounds of applause here. The first one is for the panel, who did a great job of responding. Thank you, everyone. But the other one is for Mike Petrilli. It is not easy to put a big idea out into the ether and then not only have everyone vote against you, but also have your colleagues in the back of the room vote against you too. So mad respect to Mike Petrilli for trying to push the debate. That's what think tanks are for. And thanks to the Thomas B. Fordham Institute for hosting and for all of you coming and participating in this. And DFER, we turned this was an internet debate that some of us were having about a month ago, and we decided to air our dirty laundry in front of a big audience, and I think it actually turned out pretty well. So thank you, DFER, Fordham, all of you, panelists. Thanks.